from Music for All and presented by Yamaha. It's Teaching Social Emotional Learning Through Music, a practical web series for all music educators, embedding SEL into music education. On this episode, we welcome composer Randall Standridge, educator Michael J. West, and students from Round Lake High School. Please welcome our host of Teaching Social Emotional Learning Through Music, Scott Edgar.
Hi everybody, welcome to our next episode of Teaching Social and Emotional Learning Through Music. Folks, today we're in for just something that we should have realized a long time ago. That if we really want to know how students are feeling about something, well, why don't we just ask them? So we are so thrilled today to be joined by Mr. Michael West from Round Lake High School in Round Lake, Illinois, and his students as we start to unpack a really special marching band show that they had envisioned pre-COVID times. And we're going to talk to them today about why this show is unique. How does this show truly embody identity, belonging, and agency? And how does it really get at the heart of not only this program, but this community? Know that this is part of a two-parter that we're going to sandwich together. So the first part, we're going to talk to Mr. West and his students, and then we're going to bring composer Randall Standridge in for the second half of this. So, Mr. West, why don't we start with you, sir? What does it mean for you to have your students represented on this show?
It means a lot of different things because I'm just extremely proud of them. I think they're some of the most intelligent, thoughtful people that I know. And so I'm excited to let them voice what they thought about this show, what they thought about this process. And initially when we were talking about having students talk for our program, we brought up a lot of different names. And so it is fantastic to have these four people here. And I know they're going to be a great voice for all the fantastic students in the program. And I'm excited for them. I'm excited to spend this extra time with them. And these kinds of conversations is what makes teaching worth it for me. It's not the notes that they play, but these conversations and being in the storage room where they're hanging out during an off period and having casual conversations. That's where I really get to know them. And these four individuals, I feel I at least think that I know them well. I don't know what they would have to say yet, but I would hope that I really know them. And they're just great people.
And that's what we're after. To me, this is the epitome of agency. It's the amplification of voice, and I love every second of this. Mike, can you just do us a favor, just to set the stage really quickly? Just tell us a little bit about this show so we have something to hang our hat on.
Sure. So the show that we were planning to do prior to COVID times was a Dia de los Muertos show. And we had been doing competitive marching band for a few years, and so we were kind of looking at a couple of shows, and we always kind of asked the students at the end of one season what show do they want to do in the future, and we get a bunch of ideas, but consistently we would always get recommendations of some type of Latinx show, and we searched for a while, and several years we had a hard time finding music that would fit our students' music ability at the time, what the kids really wanted out of the show. And when we came across this one, we thought that it was a good cross-section of what we were trying to look for. And we announced it to the kids, and they were super excited. And I think through this conversation, you're going to hear both the excitement, maybe some nerves that they had about it, some conversations we had in the planning process. But yeah, that's kind of how we started this journey.
And already, everyone who's watching and listening right now knows that this is a special program, and I'm not going to hide it. I'm a fan of Round Lake High School and the great work that they're doing in their program and in their school. So let's get to know some of our students that we're working with. Peter, Fabi, NAE, and Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today. It's just such an honor to have you be part of our program and to let us in just a little bit into the student perspective of this really special show. But before we do that, we need to understand how cool this program is. So Fabi, can you tell us a little bit about what the band program at Round Lake means to you?
So the band program to me, I think it's basically that FRAP phrase that we usually use, family, responsibility, attitude, and pride. It really it does embody that family aspect of it, because at least for my clarinet section, I really do consider them like sisters. They are the sisters that I never had. They are so supportive. Mr. West is really the best mentor that I could have ever asked for. Everyone in this program is just super supportive and caring with everybody. And I think that is basically the program, like to some people, it might just be like another class, but to many people, basically the majority of the band, it's a family.
Absolutely. And, we know that families don't always get along, right? There's squabbles, and that doesn't mean that it's all hunky-dory. But, there has to be something about that family atmosphere because, the show that we're going to be digging in deeply to right now, this is very personal to many of you. And this is something that is part of your culture. And this is going to bring up many, many conversations that have to do with racism, cultural appropriation, cultural appreciation. So there has to be something in this culture and this environment that allowed these conversations to happen in a way where people felt like their voice mattered, where it wasn't just, oh, I'm talking. Mr. West is like, whatever. I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. So, Peter, can you tell us a little bit about what about this program made it a safe space to even explore a show like this?
Well, going off of what Fabi said, like family is like the center point of our band, like we're very family, like we're just all about family. And like Mr. West makes it known that anyone can talk to everyone, anyone can talk to him about anything. And he really makes us trust him in the point of talking about anything to him, whether about other people or family problems, anything. He goes to a deeper level, unlike just what family should mean in band. And like thinking of like the show, like if it was another band director, like we would definitely not have that deeper meaning of what the show means to us.
Absolutely. So have there been things that Mr. West has done tangibly to facilitate that trusting environment in your program?
Yeah, so he always like takes the time to like ask us how we're doing and like share how we're doing just with family, with homework, school, just outside problems, school problems. He'll share stories of his own of how he's feeling. He'll tell us, and just going on that deeper level of like how he's doing so that we feel trusted enough to tell him how we're doing.
Absolutely. Mr. West, does that resonate with you? Do you actually do that?
I hope that I do. So like it's good to hear those things from Peter. Like just thinking from a director's perspective, because I know we're going to have band directors listen to this as well. I think the things that stick out to me that I try and actively do to make sure that the kids feel safe is on a day-to-day basis. I mentioned it already, like being in the music storage room to me is like one of the best parts of my job when they're just hanging in there on off period, and I can go in and joke around with them. And sometimes I ask them for their missing work that they have, but I may jump in a game of Uno with them, and I think it's those moments, at least for me, that make them feel comfortable that they can come to me with anything, that I am a teacher, but they can talk to me. And I almost always, I feel like I'm a broken record sometimes, but I feel like I always tell students you can come talk to me about anything. And I really hope that resonates with them. I know usually by senior year, I have a couple of seniors who will say, like, I've been in your office and like, I can't count how many times I've cried in front of you already. And like, not that I'm making them cry. I'm not the one causing that. But I know I've had a lot of heart-to-hearts with students, and I think throughout their process in high school, I think there's a lot of different instances where we have conversations that allowed us to get to this point, to have the other conversation. We didn't just jump straight to, all right, we're doing this show. What do you think?
So building upon years and years of trust and building to this point, and seeing the journey of this program firsthand, the things that we're talking about today didn't happen overnight. These are things that needed to have a trusting base, a relationship in place, so that we're able to talk about. So let's dig into this really, really special show. Michelle, what were your original thoughts? Maybe some concerns when Mr. West said he wanted to do a Dia de los Muertos show.
So I wasn't concerned much because Mr. West, when he has questions about like something like culture wise, he always comes to his students and he asks specific questions. He's really good at asking questions, is one of my favorite things about him. He gets into detail and he makes sure that he understands before getting into something. And honestly, I wasn't nervous because he would have done something wrong. If anything, I was nervous because our community is really sensitive with like our culture. So I was more nervous of them taking it to the wrong hand instead of going where like Mr. West wants to go. And yeah, it's pretty much like what everybody says. Mr. West is make sure he does his information right. And yeah.
So, Michelle, spot on. So, where could this have gone? What's, we have this show that we're putting out there that is authentic to a really, really precious tradition, especially for people from Mexico. And what are different ways that could have been perceived in your community?
So, it could have gone either where it was like, oh, he's just trying to like put more detail into it. And he's like trying to make sure that people understand that it's not just a show, we're trying to appreciate the culture and everything. Or it could have gone where he's like, oh, he's using our culture to make a show. Like, it's a big difference. Even though we just flop the words around, it makes a really big difference.
What way is that arrow going? 100%, Michelle. Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah, so some people like to use what we call like our little necklaces, for example, that we have for like La Virgen de Guadalupe, which is like God's mother. A lot of people say that they just use it for style and they don't even appreciate that. And so it could go that direction where we seem like we're not appreciating the culture and we're just doing it just because it's like popular or whatever. Or it could go where they're like, oh, he's like trying to put a word into it and he's trying to make it a big deal and put more eyes into it.
Absolutely. And, to kind of dig a little deeper into this, I think that this is exactly where we're going to start to draw the line between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. And how are we going to get this right? Well, the answer is that Mr. West wanted to do this right, and he knew that exactly how you just said, Michelle, that he was going to have to ask more questions. And from a band director standpoint, who's designed many, many marching band shows, I totally get that most of the time we just kind of do it. And that wasn't going to fly for this one. So I want to go to NAE and ask a little bit about what does it mean that Mr. West wanted to get the perspectives of the students, especially when it got into the design element?
I think especially once you get to know Mr. West, he is a very detail-oriented person. He likes to be very exact about what he wants to see and what he wants to do. And he's just overall a very organized person. So it really meant a lot on a more personal level that he did want to have input from the band and from students and, from our families about a culture that he didn't know of and he didn't know all the details of. And I feel like that was one of the first steps in really identifying, how can we avoid that cultural appropriation, appreciation, as well as putting out a show that would represent the community in the way we all wanted it to.
Perfect. Thank you. Absolutely. Now, understanding that the community, while largely Latinx, isn't all Latinx. So the concern about when we're putting a piece of art out there, a piece of marching band art out there, that we want to make sure that it is accessible. And let's just own it. Most of the people who are going to see the show are the Friday night football crowd, right? And they're out there cheering for the football team. But not everyone's going to be of that culture and understand what is at the heart of this holiday, this celebration. So, Peter, Latinx, that's not your background. That's not your heritage. That's not where your experiences have come. But obviously, your friends have. So what was it like when Mr. West said, we're going to do a Dia de los Muertos show? And what's that mean to you?
So when it first was announced, I was very excited. Getting to do something that, I've never experienced or ever done. But it was definitely like nerve-wracking, whether like we're going to offend anyone, or like am I going to offend anyone since I'm in the show, and I'm white. I don't know anything about it. But then going off of that, like it's a very good learning experience opportunity. you know I might not know anything about it, but the show put me in the right direction to where I can learn something about it. I can take that extra step to educate myself.
And that's what it's all about, right? I think that's where Mr. West probably modeled that this wasn't his culture. This wasn't where he's come from. And he was like, I really want to do this show. But if I'm the only one who's speaking, then that's not going to really get at the heart of what this holiday is. Mr. West, what were your thoughts about it from this perspective?
Well, I just want to echo exactly what Peter said about nerves, because I am also white, and just as Peter was nervous about taking on that role as a performer in the show, I was nervous as a white director creating and designing this show for a different culture. And my approach, again, just speaking from a director's perspective for anyone that's listening, was also I could do the show with the kids, the show that they want to do that's been requested a lot, and try my best to make the best possible show and get as much information as I could to design a show that was representative of their community, of their culture. Or I could choose not to do it. And I feel like choosing not to do it was more of a disservice as a director than putting my best foot forward and trying to do it. So even though I was nervous, I'm sure it's some point or in multiple meetings with everyone here and other students, like I vocalized that I was nervous and I was afraid to do it as well. So hopefully, as long as we were all a little bit nervous together, we could produce a product that we were proud of. And just like we talk about with SEL and other terms, like as long as we vocalize how we are feeling with our students, it is much easier to move forward on whatever process you have.
Thanks for the vulnerability there, Mike, and I totally understand. But, sometimes when we have those nerves are those twinge that prevent us from doing a truly spectacular thing, and to have the courage to fight through. And knowing that you had the support of your students, we're going to talk about the leadership team in just a little bit, who was very instrumental in the production of this show. But Michelle, Mr. West has always wanted this to be about the community, really wanted it to bring not only a centering voice for the band community, but the Round Lake City community at large. So can you talk a little bit about some of the things that Mr. West did to engage the community?
We technically made all of the leadership and people like in regular band ask our parents, see how they felt about it. And most parents did like it, but most parents didn't. And they were kind of worried about it. But from my family's point of view, they were all okay with it, and they were honestly cheering it on.
Why were they cheering it on, Michelle?
They want people to appreciate our culture a little bit more here, and doing a show like this is going to honestly affect a lot of things, positive and negative, but honestly it's going to bring more positivity than anything.
What were some of the positive things that you were hoping that would come out of the show?
Hopefully it's gonna not end, but like sort of help with like a little bit of the racism that goes on inside of school. And yeah.
Oh, okay. Are you willing to unpack that a little bit about some of the things that you feel inside the school? I know we've had these conversations, and I know that it's being actively addressed, but what are some of the concerns about the racism that's being felt inside the school?
So inside the school, there's a lot of kids that aren't Mexican that always calls people like beaners, or like just says things that just don't go with us. And we can't really say much because then we're scared of them, or they say things like that.
Okay. So this show was going to position a space that we're proud of our heritage, that we're going to put it center stage, and this is exactly where we want to engage. We're proud of this, and we are here. Now, as you said so well, Michelle, that this wasn't universally accepted. It wasn't like, oh, this is a great idea, all in. Some parents were a little bit concerned. Fabi, I believe your parents had some concerns.
Yeah, so, well, my mom, like, she did like the idea that we were going to present our culture to the community, and like we were going to really present the most beautiful aspects of it. She did have more concerns because there is racism in the school, and whether we want to accept it or not, whether we want to think that we're like a united community, there's always going to be things that like occur. And she just felt like because of all the technology that there is today, because of all like the access that we all have to social media, anything could be taken out of context, anything could be recorded and just like completely blown out of proportion. So she wanted our culture to be like really blown up and just shown to the world, but there was also that concern that maybe people were just going to take it and run with it in the opposite direction.
Absolutely. There's always that concern when you put yourself out there front and center. Annie, do you have some thoughts?
So kind of thinking about community and kind of outside of the school. So our school is majority Latinx, and that's kind of a very prevalent fact that we've been talking about. Talking about kind of like outside, there is another school that is the complete opposite. They are majority white, and there's been a history of like animosity between the schools kind of because of that fact. And I know personally, I remember an instance where, something happened with the other school. And a lot of our students showed up to a football game and kind of wanted to represent the fact that they were Latinx and kind of be proud of that fact in a way to spite them. And I feel like this show would have been very important, not like to our students as a way for them to be proud of themselves and like another way to show their pride in their heritage.
And absolutely. So thank you for that. Just a little bit of context on the community, but understanding that this show was going to be about honor. This show was going to be about respect. And you mentioned the word spite. And I think there's a lot of that going on in our world right now. It's like, this is who I am, and I'm going to put it out there as aggressively as possible. And this was a moment to kind of center around. Powerful. And all of this together just means that we needed more voices at the table. So Fabi, we're going to come back to you because Mr. West very early on in the planning went to the leadership team and said, we got to talk about this. We got to figure this out. So can you talk a little bit about what he did to involve the leadership team?
Yeah, so one of the very first leadership meetings that we actually had all together was basically talking about cultural appropriation and just saying how are we going to make this show without offending everyone, or how are we going to make this show as authentic as possible. And we really had a long conversation, and going back to us being comfortable with him, we've spilled our hearts out that day because we really talked about how we felt. We talked about how Dia de los Muertos is basically like our childhood, like we grow up honoring the dead, we grow up doing this stuff. So we had a long conversation about how costumes could be an issue, how some people might think that maybe it's like mocking the culture, how maybe like the style that we play the music could also be mocking the culture. And it was just a lot of conversations, a lot of different like scenarios that we just had to play out to make it basically work.
Can you give us an example of what that looked like in one of the meetings?
So we talked about how the style that we had to play the music with was a lot more like, I guess, like cultural, because you hear a song and you can identify that it's not necessarily traditional, to us at least, but it might be traditional to a different area of the world. It might be traditional to a different culture. So there was that moment where we had to realize that we were going to play something that we weren't necessarily used to.
Absolutely. And something that just because you weren't used to something, this is something that is probably more meaningful. So some of these conversations from a band director perspective, going into the leadership team and saying, let's chat about this, I'd be sweating a little bit. There'd be a little bit of nerves that would come up from a director standpoint. So Anna, can you tell us a little bit about what those discussions looked like when we were really getting into the heart of this material?
So at the beginning of our conversations as a team, Mr. West would very much lead it at first, and then kind of let us bounce out our ideas between each other. as it got later into the show and we were talking about, you know, what aspects of the culture to represent in it, it was a lot of back and forth about, you know, what would be okay to put in and kind of how we need to incorporate that into the symbolism of it and not just using it as an aesthetic for the show. I know, especially costuming, it was a lot about we wanted to choose folklorico dresses. But especially with those, every single state has a different dress and style that signifies something. So we can't just choose whatever we think is going to look the prettiest or move the best on the field. You know, as much as that is an important factor, we also need to consider the culture of it and how this is important to somebody in our community and to families that we're trying to honor and respect within our show.
Perfectly stated. So the costumes were one example. Okay, a little bit of curveball, folks. Given that this is part of at least 3 of your cultures, you know, you grew up celebrating Dia de los Muertos. What were some things that you said, you know, I definitely want to make sure that this is represented in the show? This is central to my belief about this holiday. Anna, can we start with you? Was there anything other than costumes that you thought, you know, I definitely want this to be part of the show?
I feel like especially within the symbolism of Dia de los Muertos and with, you know, Coco coming out, it's like very, very soon as we started representing our show, the ofrenda was something that we were talking about and we wanted to include, but it is a very central piece of the holiday, and to misrepresent that would be very, you know, costly in a way of like misrepresenting something or offending the culture.
Powerful, costly, you know, that word's resonating with me right now. The ofrenda is the altar, right? So that really is, from my limited understanding, central to this space of honoring those who have passed before us. Michelle, any parts of your experience with Dia de los Muertos that you would just say this has to be part of the show?
With La Ofrenda, how we usually do it is we put a picture of our past ones in the middle, and then so there's 3 tables that we do. In the middle is going to be them and like their favorite flower, and then in the bottom would be like their favorite foods and their favorite foods. And then in the top we would put like little pictures of good memories that we have with them and just things that represent them to us. It's pretty much what we do.
Absolutely. Fabi, your thoughts. What's something that you just would say, you know, this has to be part of our show?
So in my opinion, I really do think that the colors of Dia de los Muertos is a very important part of it, because it kind of shows like the beauty of life, the rainbow of life, that like you start off as a kid, you're really like colorful and joyful, and then you go through your life and it's still as joyful as it was from the minute that you were born. And then once you end your life, that's the moment where people celebrate you, and it's just as beautiful. So I feel like all those colors coming together, it would have been so cool to just see everyone on the field with all the flags. It would have been perfect.
And just context for everybody, you know, this show hasn't happened yet. It was paused, so it's still coming, folks. And the goal is this upcoming fall, I believe. Fabi, let's stay with you for just a second and talk about the culture that is the leadership team, and what does that culture look like?
So that culture is, like I said in the beginning, it's family. So when Mr. West chooses his captains, we all basically like, we make a group chat, right? And like we get together, we talk to each other, we make kind of like this connection between each other to where like maybe we're not best friends, but we work together in a team. We have to like really work together in that like really harmonious pattern, because we're going to be together the whole summer. We're going to work together with our sections, and we have to all fit together like a piece of a puzzle. So, I mean, we have to go into this together, because there's no way that we're going to make a show if the leaders of the band aren't fully in there. So we talked about how this show could really like affect the band, how since some of the people aren't really from Latinx culture, how the leadership was going to talk to our sections about it, how we were going to educate our sections so that we all understand the concept of it, so that it could be 10 times better than it would have.
And I would say 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, those conversations had to be present. It had, you had to have the space. So, there's a danger, and we've all kind of talked about it, but we haven't really kind of called it what it is. This show could be cultural appropriation. We're taking the best parts that are going to look flashy. We're going to put the costumes out there. We'll put in a friend on the 50-yard line, and we'll put marigolds out there. And but wait a second, that's not what the holiday is. That's not respect. So, with that being said, these are the concerns that were kind of floating around taking this really risk to have a powerful piece of art out there. But what does cultural appropriation mean to you? Michelle, let's start with you, please.
Technically, what it means to me, it's just the respect. All you really have to do is respect the culture and make sure that you dig into it before you talk about it with people, because it is a really sensitive topic.
Yeah. So, Michelle, I'm going to be honest with you. I've heard people talk for hours on cultural appropriation, and you just summed it up in 10 seconds. It's about respect and asking questions. That's what separates appropriation from appreciation. Perfect.
Yeah.
Other thoughts? Does anyone else have a thought about what cultural appropriation means to you? N.A.?
It's very similar to what Michelle was saying with respect. I feel like when somebody does appropriate another person's culture, it is disrespectful in a very big way. To me, culture is a very integral part of a person and what makes up their personality. So to kind of disrespect it and to misrepresent it is very offensive, not only to that person, but to their family and to their culture as a whole.
And what's so tough about something like this is with the purest of intent, with the purest of Mr. West saying we're going to come together and we're going to do this beautiful marching band show that is respectful, you can still appropriate a culture. There's danger there, and that's why this dialogue that we're all talking about is just so central. All right, Fabi, we're going to go back to you because we're kind of hinting at where I want to go next, and this is this idea of having an intentional approach to culture. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the initial purpose that we wanted was just to show the community our culture. It was to show the beauty of it. It was to show like how complex it could be, but how simple its beauty really is.
That's simple. We don't need to go into as much depth often. We just need to ask and get the right questions out there. Mr. West, so my guess is this intentional approach was at the heart of everything that we're talking about right now, right?
Yeah, more or less. Like, I want to emphasize what a lot of the students just said about cultural appropriation. And like you said, Michelle summed it up beautifully about respect and asking questions. And in my head right now, I'm thinking about the other directors who may want to do something similar in their programs, or like how do I even begin this process with my students to have this kind of conversation. My thought process the whole time was about asking questions. When we sat down with that intentional approach and we talked about the dresses, and they brought up how there is a different dress with each state, I was asking questions like, okay, what do these dresses look like? What do they mean to each state? And like, as they gave me more information, as a band director, I have those wheels turning of like, okay, could we do this on the field? Like, could this be, could each color guard member have a different dress for each state so that we're representing everyone? And I would just pitch those questions back out to the students. And I think an important part of it too was, I think everyone here in this conversation would back up. I often tell the students, I'm about to say something. You let me know if I'm being an idiot. Like, my students always have permission to tell me that I'm wrong. They do so frequently, and I appreciate it. But I think it's also, again, going back to the beginning of our conversation of like, that's what helped creates that comfortable space to allow this conversation to have. I ask just a lot of what if questions. They give me information. They're the ones educating me about this culture. And I say, could we do this on the field? And they either say yes or no. And I think that really helped us start that pathway of designing a show that hopefully was eventually going to be intentional rather than cultural appropriation.
100%. And that thoughtfulness, that vulnerability, that I'm listening louder than I'm speaking, is so essential always, but especially when we're working outside of our own comfort zone, our own culture. So understanding, raise your hand if you're a senior, please. Raise your hand if you're a senior. So we have a couple of people who are on the way out and understanding that you are going to soon be alumni of this program. So understanding that, while you may not be able to actually take the field on this show, and I understand that that's probably ripping your hearts out, and this would be something that would be incredibly meaningful. Something tells me Mr. West will find some way to get you involved, but notwithstanding that. So Anna, can you tell me a little bit about what it's going to mean to be an alumna of this program, and what it means to be a part of this community?
I think especially growing up in this community and with the band, as Fabi has been echoing over and over, it's about family. These past 4 years, I've had a bunch of different families, but one of the ones that is stuck is this band family. So to be able to kind of leave and come back and see them performing something that is not only significant of my culture, but kind of, it was supposed to be my last season. So in a way, being able to help this much is kind of like my last hurrah of being in the marching band. So I think it'll really mean a lot to be able to see something out there, and for, my first show looking on as an outsider to be something that would mean so much to me as a whole and to my family and everyone in this community.
Doesn't make it any easier though, does it? So understanding that this entire show is about talking to people out there who are and trying to understand experiences that are not our own. So I'm going to stick with you, Anna, and can you help us with what advice you would give to other band directors?
Definitely, if you're doing something that's focusing on a culture of a certain part of your student body, talk to them. There's nobody that knows it best than somebody who experienced it and grew up with it. And, wanting to represent them is also wanting to represent who they are as a person and kind of what brought them to become that.
And that dialogue needs to be had. And, we are just so honored that we were able to have a space, some time to really delve into the thoughts and perspectives of students, of culture bearers, of culture holders around this show. And to also, Peter, to hear your perspectives on what it might be like to be in this program, doing a show that means so much to a certain culture. And they're your friends, they're your family, as we've said over and over. But this isn't your culture. And we're all coming together as one band doing this. So with that being said, does anyone have any closing thoughts about this experience, about what this show is going to look like in the fall?
So I think it's going to be so beautiful just because we didn't get our last season, and the last year's freshmen didn't really get a season at all. So the next freshmen that are coming in, they're going to be able to take this and just run with it. They're going to be able to make this their own because now they're the new band, they're going to be the new family that just makes this amazing. So it's just going to be really cool as an alumni to just come back and see that, to see them have fun with their culture, to see them just really embrace it and show that they're proud of it.
Embrace, proud, moving forward. Friends, this has just been absolutely fabulous. So now we're going to transition to talk to Mr. West and the composer of this show, Randall Standridge. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye. Welcome to our next episode of Teaching Social and Emotional Learning Through Music. Folks, today's a special one. The entire series is about connecting the dots for teachers about how social and emotional learning is coming from composers, coming from educational leaders. Well, it just made a little bit of sense that if we're going to do this, why don't we just have a composer and a teacher on together to talk about how these dots connect? So today we are really, really fortunate to have composer Randall Standridge and band director from Round Lake High School in Round Lake, Illinois, Mike West, here to talk about how Mike is adapting one of Randall's marching band shows for his students in a way that is just embedded with social and emotional learning and cultural responsivity. So I can't wait to hear these two fine musicians and teachers talk about how this world is colliding in just a great, great way. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to start with Randall. Randall, can you tell us just a little bit about your journey? Because I know that you've had a history as a music teacher, and it wasn't like you came out of the womb composing. You've had a lot of things that have informed your journey up until this point.
Well, sure. And again, thank you for having me here. Just to give you the kind of the Reader's Digest version of my history, I've lived my entire life in Arkansas. I grew up in Little Rock, and was very fortunate to grow up in a very, what I would call safe family. And what I mean by that is my parents were definitely, and still are very blue collar people. My dad was a factory worker. My mother worked as a child caregiver, in daycares and things like that. But they were both very, very creative people in their own way, and very encouraging of creativity within our household. So myself and my brothers were always encouraged to pursue our artistic interests, whether it was, art, music, acting, whatever. None of that was off limits to us. And so at an early age, when I started composing, they showed a lot of interest in it and encouragement, which, for any child is just great. It makes you want to do more and more of that. As I went through school and was able to pursue my love of music in a band setting at Sheridan High School, I, again, was very fortunate to have very, very open and caring and encouraging directors who nurtured that love of composition and love of music, which continued on to university, where I received a bachelor's of education in music education. And on the side, studied composition with Dr. Tom O'Connor, not as part of a major, not as anything even anticipating what I would do now. It was just because it was fun and I enjoyed doing it. From there, I became a band director. I was a band director at the Harrisburg Public Schools in Harrisburg, Arkansas for 12 years. And it was a very interesting situation. That is what you would call a Title I school. So it was very... like the median household income was $16,000 a year, 100% of the students on free and reduced lunch. And, very, very rough school, very rough school. Great kids. I have nothing but positive things to say about the kids, but it was just a very challenging situation. And on top of that, I was the only band director for many of those years. I did get an assistant the last few years, but for most of my time there, I taught the 5th grade recorder band, the 6th grade beginning band, the 7th or 8th junior high band, and then the 9th through 12th high school band. That was all me. And so I did that for several years. And during that time, I was, of course, writing for my band and just for pleasure. Started getting published, wrote a lot of marching band stuff for people, because in all modesty, my little band was killing it. And so, of course, anytime somebody sees your band's doing good and you're designing for it yourself, you start getting picked up by other people to design for them too. So it all just kind of spiraled, the publishing, everything. And it got to where I was basically working 2 jobs. One is a full-time band director, which I don't have to tell you or your listeners is a full-time job. That is a major commitment. And then on top of that, trying to manage a budding composition and arranging career. And it just got to be where it was impossible to do that and find a good work-life balance. Because I'm married, I've been married for 23 years. And, I have friends, family, I've got other interests besides music, but there was just no time for it. And so I made the hardest single decision of my life, which was to leave teaching and pursue a career as a full-time composer, which, and I don't really have any regrets because it's turned out great. The band community has been very receptive to what I'm doing. But I would be lying if I didn't say that I missed it. I miss being in the classroom very much, and I'm just very happy that I get to participate in the arena that I do. And so now I own my own publishing company. I'm writing all the time, and I try to get in some teaching every chance I get.
Randall, it sounds like so much of your story was in spaces where belonging mattered, where you had to foster belonging, where that was just a critical element that you had to work through to be able to get to the music. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you saw in your teaching life, how building that relationship, that safe space where belonging was critical, manifested in your settings?
Well, I think it started with my realization, and I'm sure this was naivete on my part, but having such a great home life, like I'm not one of those dramatic stories where there's some like dark secret. Like my childhood and home life was great. My parents are amazing; they're my heroes. Having that background, and then going to the school that I taught at, where the large majority of the students came from single parent households, households where there was a lot of animosity between parents, and just this kind of totally different environment that was alien to me. The first thing that I came to realize, because obviously, fresh out of college, it's like, oh, we're just teaching music, but it quickly became apparent that my program, especially given that I would be teaching a lot of these kids from fifth grade all the way to when they graduate, it became a great source of stability for them. And without meaning to, like, it was never an intent. Like, I became I don't really want to say a parental figure, but definitely a consistent authority figure for a lot of the students. And so with that responsibility, it became more and more necessary for the band program to exemplify those traits, as well as the musical traits, to be this safe space where kids could be themselves, where they would know exactly what to expect from year to year and provide some type of stability for them to really grow. That became very, very important to me. And I'll be honest, by the end of my career, that became the focus of the job.
100%. I just can't wait to kick it to Mike, because everything that you just said, I know resonates with Mike, and I can't wait to hear his story. Just to translate just for a second into the SEL world, what we're talking about now is what we call developmental relationships, that we see our kids for, as you said, Randall, fifth grade on. We see them more than any other teacher in the school, and it's impossible not to build that relationship. We have that continuity, and that is just one of the greatest gifts that we have. So, Mike, as I was hearing Randall talk, I could have heard you talk. And full disclosure, folks, I've spent a lot of time in Mr. West's classroom and seen the brilliance that he works with his students. So just such an honor to be able to bring him into this discussion. So, Mike, can you tell us just a little bit about your journey and maybe just a little bit of response? Because, similar journeys between what you and what Randall just said.
My path to Round Lake was definitely non-traditional, I would say. So grew up in southern burbs of Chicago, attended a very large high school of like 4,000 students. So like that band program was very big. Loved band, loved all music stuff. Went off and studied at University of Illinois. But when I started there, I wasn't going for music education. I actually did my bachelor's in communication and did a lot of work in graphic design, film stuff, a variety of media, but like really focusing on some storytelling and connecting with people. And then as I got towards the end of my bachelor's degree, I realized that I was spending all my time with my friends who were music ed people, all my time with the marching Illini, and by the end of it, I'm like, well, I've enjoyed this degree, but I think I might be heading not down quite the right path. And I was also working for a marching band camp during the summer. So by the end of that, I started doing my master's in music ed with certification. And as I went through that process, I think an important part for me to also talk about is where I student taught, because it definitely influenced how I taught, obviously, at Round Lake. But I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today is community and family and that engagement with all different stakeholders. And so when I looked for my student teaching placement, I knew I came from a large school. I went to a large university, so it's important for me to go to a smaller program or really a smaller town just so I got a variety of experience. And I ended up teaching if anyone is familiar with Brazil, Indiana, Bob Medworth teaches at Northview High School. And that was really just something that changed completely the way that I viewed music and a program, a powerhouse program, but also a small town. And my first glimpse at it was attending their holiday concert, and it was just packed. Like, it was clear that like the town came there, like this was an event they look forward to. And so when we talk about the marching band show later, like there's definitely a drive of doing what Bob did at Northview, but recreating it that fit for Round Lake. And I could talk about Bob Medworth for hours because he's a fantastic educator. But he, like, just watching him teach really showed me like what it meant to like respond to students and care for students. And it wasn't just, like I said, putting on a concert, but it was putting on a community event. And so after I student taught with Bob, Round Lake was only my second interview. And I was excited to be at a school, and like there was also like little things that kind of called me to Round Lake. They're blue and gold. My high school colors are blue and gold. There's just like a lot of parallels I saw in my life. I'm like, I feel like this could be a good thing. And so now it's year 8 being at Round Lake, and similar to what Randall was saying, like Round Lake is a Title I school. When I stepped in, they were on the upswing. They were coming out of the state taking over the school, and so like definitely rebuilding some finances, rebuilding infrastructure. And I know I'm not the only educator to experience this, but like definitely taking over a program is like, okay, we need to fix a lot of instruments. We got to buy some new instruments. We got to do a lot of recruiting. Like there was a ton to do that was on the to-do list. But like the kids were super excited. And so those first couple of years was like, I'm just going with what I know and what I like, things that are just immediate that come to our mind in terms of like, okay, they need to be playing this kind of music. We need to be doing these kinds of warm-ups, and like just exposing them to that stuff. And as I would say maybe exited year 4, year 5, and there was like now a foundation, definitely more reflection on, okay, like responding even more to the student voice, responding to like, we have them here now. We've taught them a lot of fundamentals. What else are we going to do to enhance the program and build towards like some of those other community events that I saw in my student teaching process? And then Scott, when you joined us, was it two years ago now? I'm losing all track of time.
The pandemic just paused all time. Are you kidding me?
Yeah,
so it was just last year.
It was just last year, yeah. But we talked a lot about just, like I said, responding to the students and how can we empower them more? How can we engage them more? Because I was definitely at a point where we saw more community interest, more investment. One of, I think, the biggest things for us is our holiday program that we put on. Just a little bit of background. It's not just a holiday concert, but it's a combination of band, choir, guard, and our theater group, and we put on 3 shows, and it's a packed house. It didn't start out that way. We definitely built up to that, but like it is definitely something that people look forward to, and we made that like a pillar of what we do now, and kids love that we do it. And so I was looking for more ways of like, okay, we have these parents involved, we have these students involved, the administrators are looking here. How can we get another part of our parents involved? And so part of that for me was also in the marching band setting that we're going to talk about. I want to get them involved in other ways, but we definitely have a lot of parents who have not experienced music before, or what we know like the band culture is like. And so our average parent doesn't know that like we need volunteers on the weekend, or like why a student really needs to be here for this rehearsal. If they miss it, like that is going to affect our performance. And that's, before I jump too far ahead in what we want to discuss, that's kind of where we're at today.
Certainly, Mike, and absolutely. Can you tell us just a little bit more about your community? Because
Yes.
you were talking just a little bit about what they don't know, but folks, Round Lake is just a wealth of culture and family and beauty, and share a little bit about that for us.
Yes, we as teachers are still diving into it. So like through the pandemic, we're even taking a closer look at what our community is built up as. So like on a very like broad scope is largely Hispanic. Like we have 78% Hispanic students, 12% white, 7% black, and then a mix of other demographics. And so we have some of those families in our community that have gone through music. Like those are our booster president, our booster secretary, and like they went through music programs of their own. We are also very lucky that almost every single parent that's on our school board is a fine arts parent. And so like they know a lot about what we need to do to build up the program, and they have helped us out a lot. In terms of our larger community, it's such an interesting thing because we're actually made up of 5 different towns. So we're like, we are a unit district, but like the education system is the only thing that really ties all 5 towns together. And there is like so many like fantastic restaurants and family-owned businesses. We have a large amount of students who, like I said, Hispanic, but their parents were born in Mexico and often travel back for a whole month, like during the holidays or during the summer, to really spend a lot of time with family. And like I would say, if anything, our community, like the most prevalent value is family that's tying everything together. And I would also add too, like as we developed the values for our music program, we made that a centerpiece for us. And so we have 4 values at Round Lake that we often recite: family, responsibility, attitude, pride. Lots of programs have some type of variation of that or other values that like they use as their core to guide their decisions and process in which they do. But we knew early on that family was something that was going to connect us with our community, and we're still figuring out what does family mean for music as well, if it's different for each individual family within our community. So it is, I feel like there's so many other untold stories that we are still discovering, not just as a music program, but as a district. Like I would say that's something we talk about in department meetings and booster meetings, at Board of Education meetings. How do we communicate with the parents what resonates with them, showing them what else the school district can do for our community.
100%. Mike, that was great. And, you know, I think this is going to dovetail because you talked about resonating and what's going to resonate. And Randall, I want to bring it back to you and just get your frame of mind when you're composing a piece of music and what goes through the creative process when you're thinking explicitly about how that musical product's going to connect with students, knowing that right now we have one degree of separation, but oftentimes we don't realize the relationship between the composer, the director, and the student. So what does that look like in the compositional process?
I can definitely say that my compositional process is very abstract. And what I mean by that is it's really a large portion of my compositional process is simply based on abstract qualities, just like chords, melodies, sounds, rhythms. You know, it's always nice to be able to bring in emotional elements, narrative elements, subjective elements. But I approach music, you know, again, from that kind of abstract spot, which you know, it'll be fun to talk about one aspect of the show that Mike's doing in a second that ties into that, because there's, you know, the one part that people are gonna be like, well, you know, what does this have to do with the theme? But it just abstractly fits, if not narratively, you know. But that's really how I approach it, because to me, as a composer, it's important that a piece be able to work on its own merits. So, for instance, you know, if a piece has a great story, or if it's based on a great narrative element, some historical event, some emotional event, that's all well and good, but it can still be a bad piece of music. Like, that's just the bottom line, you know, point blank, period. It can be bad, but if you approach a piece abstractly and make sure that on its own musical merits, on its form, on its construction, on its melody, counter melody, all of those elements, its orchestration, if all of those work devoid of any story, then it's a successful piece of music. Now, having said that, I mean, it's funny. I'm sure a lot of people find it funny to hear me say that, because so many of my works have such strong narrative elements. You know, one of my more recent works, for instance, The Nine, which is based around the Little Rock Central Nine, who were integrated into Little Rock Central High School, you know, following Brown versus the Board of Education. You know, that is a highly emotional piece, because it deals with racism, it deals with progress versus oppression, It deals with this very human story of dignity and civil rights. And, on the first draft, I did allow that to influence it. But on the second and third drafts, I did have to take that kind of emotional step away and be like, okay, I'm in love with the story, but does the piece work? And kind of go back and forth like that. So on the one hand, I would say making sure that things connect with people is, just by first recognizing what music is, which is an abstract art form. Even with the best narrative laid on top of it, it's still not a story. It's chords, it's melodies, it's notes. That may sound really basic and really cold and analytical, but I think you have to do that because students respond to good aesthetic. Students respond to good design. In marching band, we call it effect, but it's really just good aesthetic. Like that's what we're really talking about. So I take care of that first. And then if there are, specific narrative elements, specific emotional elements that I'm trying to bring out, obviously we try to layer some of those on top of that, whether they be humor, pathos, anger, joy. You try to connect with ways to do that. And the second thing I would say with that is that it helps to try to use a little bit of the language that your audience speaks in. I like to compare it to when the Catholic Church decided to start doing masses in English. Don't get me wrong, I love Latin, and I love, it's a beautiful language. But if you're going to talk to somebody, if you're going to get on somebody's level and connect with them emotionally, you have to speak their language. And so I think one of the advantages I've had as a composer is I actually got my big start as a composer as a marching band arranger. And so with marching band, of course, you're dealing with every type of genre of music you can imagine. On one show, I could be arranging classical music. On the next, it could be Broadway. On the next, it could be pop, rap, rock, hip hop, dubstep, like whatever. You have to get good at all of those. And so I'm pretty comfortable in all of the genres. And therefore, I'm comfortable in speaking the pop culture language. Because I'm going to be quite blunt. There's a bunch of, I'm not going to say they can't, but there's a lot of composers who choose not to speak in that language, which is fine, but it is a little bit like saying the Mass in Latin, because I try to find that, like if I had to say what my biggest interest in composition is, it's how does the pop culture and kind of cinematic medium meet with a symphonic presentation voice? Because I think that's where we have to be to really communicate with today's audience. And that's just my philosophy. And I know some people would agree with it, some people would disagree with it, but that's how I approach music.
Randall, thank you for that. That was, I think there's oftentimes an assumption that if a piece is going to connect to a student, that it has to be the narrative. And sometimes just the beautiful aesthetic, the sonic value of it's going to reach into their hearts and give them a connection where the student's going to be able to write their own story, where it's not being spoon-fed to them, where it's something that they're going to be able to take a creative role in that piece. So thank you for highlighting that. That's a critical thing for us to know. The other piece that I really, really enjoyed what you were just talking about is that you're taking a focus on speaking languages, different genres that are going to resonate, that are going to be more receptive. And I know this is something that Mike has taken just a new initiative and a new strength in. So Mike, can you talk just a little bit quickly about how this new idea for you to really program music that's going to resonate to your students kind of came about, and what's that looking like in your classroom now?
Well, I would say it's not entirely new. I think I'm just finally taking action on it, because I heard this voice for a long time through my students. Like I would even say it's probably as early as year 2, and something that we've spoken about before is with my Hispanic students, like one thing that they love are bachatas. And like coming in as a white kid who grew up in the suburbs, like I did not know what that word meant to begin with. But like I knew that was important for them, and so like I searched and I searched and I searched, and I could not find at that time anything that was an arrangement of bachata, and so I wanted to give it to them, but I just didn't take some of those extra steps that I finally took now. Like, okay, so rather than a bachata, what else could we do that resonates with them? Why is the bachata important to this group of students? And so we've continued to examine that, and even after we put on this marching show that we're going to talk about in a little bit, like I'm already thinking about like what are other parts of their voice do we want to represent, and not just myself and the color guard coach and the drumline instructor choosing the show of something that's going to work, but how are we working together with the students to achieve that? And so that's kind of how we ended up with the Dia de los Muertos show. Is still part of their culture. And I do want to add in here too, even though we have a large amount of Hispanic students, we also know not every Hispanic student celebrates the Dia de los Muertos. So like we know that like we're not just doing the show and like check the box. We're not done with that part of their voice. There are other things we want to do to represent their culture and represent the overall culture of our band students.
And absolutely, and I couldn't have asked for a better segue there, my friend, that we're talking about Randall's Dia de los Muertos show. And so, Randall, can you tell us a little bit about that show, where it came from, and how it was creating that show for you?
Well, thank you. And so there is kind of a backstory of the show. One thing I always tell people, there's not always a story behind everything I write, but there does happen to be kind of what I hope will be a nice story about this particular one and its start. So I was at Harrisburg where I taught. We did have a few families that came through my band program, had several students whose families were originally from Mexico. And this all plays into the story behind this piece, because what ended up happening is towards the end of my career at Harrisburg, my maternal grandmother passed away. And there were a few things with that. First, she was out of my grandparents by far. She and I were the closest. She was just you have those people in your life that are just the pillars of strength and kind of touchstones for your entire life. She was definitely one of those. I mean, for lots of reasons. Anyway, she was just an amazing one. Her passing really affected me way more than I thought. I mean, I always knew I would be upset. What I did not expect was losing so much ability to function and just to be and to be the best version of myself for my students, to write the best music for myself. It was really devastating. And so I, of course, went through a grieving process. And I had one student that I was particularly close with, was one of my flute players. And her family was from Mexico. And so one day, the students knew that she had passed, because I told them that, because a lot of them asked why I was so upset. And because I'm not good at hiding my emotions, and so this particular young lady asked, why was, or all the stuff, and she said, well, this might make you feel better. And she started telling me about Dia de los Muertos. And I'm going to be very honest. Growing up in white America, I think a lot of us were just told, "Oh, that's the Mexican version of Halloween." And and I'm going to be honest, I had never researched or anything, but this young lady, she started telling me about it. She's like, "Well, you might consider doing this. You might consider, making this kind of memorial and lighting a candle, and just taking a day to remember her. That might make you feel better." Like she was consoling me through her culture, and a lot of things struck me about that. The first thing that struck me about it was just that human connection of my student was so concerned about me that she was offering to help me. Like that's how how this was, because I think sometimes there's that kind of wall between certain individuals and their students. But she felt comfortable enough to just like, hey, you need help. Like you need help getting through this, and this is something that I do in my house, and so it might help you. So that struck me. The second thing was just the unashamed sharing of her culture, because it was it's plainly obvious that I am not from the same background that she is, and but just her feeling so strongly about this human connection. And so she talked about, and so I got very interested in the subject. I'm sorry, let me take one step back from that. Because I had so many students from Mexico, I had also during this time started making a concerted effort to try to learn Spanish. Language is very hard for me, like spoken language. I mean, I'm barely good at English, and I mean, Spanish, I'm okay now. Like, I've been studying for years now. Now I could probably maybe talk like a fifth grade Yoda, but for me, that's major progress. But it was one of those things I was trying to do to try to connect with her and my other students that have that background. And so, because of those things coming together, I got very interested in the subject of Dia de los Muertos and started, doing some research and kind of reading up on it. And it just struck me how wrong my assumptions were about, or just what I'd been told growing up, because I was so surprised to find the reverent and the celebratory nature of the holiday. And during that time when I was grieving so hard for my grandma Irene, it just kind of served as a point of comfort for me. And so that was actually the impetus. Now, the second thing with that is anytime I do anything, whether it's study a language, study whatever, I like to do what I like, as much immersion as I can. And so around this time, I have been listening to a lot of music from Mexico, from a lot of Latin-speaking or Spanish-speaking countries, and it all just kind of came together to write this show. And then, of course, I mean, there was a group that asked me to write a show similar to this. But because of that, I also knew that I knew when I wrote the show, I wanted all of the music to either come from me or to specifically avoid pulling, from that tradition. And I know that may sound backwards, but I do think, coming from the background I do, it was more appropriate. The phrase I would use is "make it, don't take it." And so I wrote that, but the only music that actually appears in the show that I did not personally compose is, ironically enough, from Camille Saint-Saëns. And again, this goes to one of those, what I was talking about earlier, the abstract idea, because let's be honest, Camille Saint-Saëns has nothing to do with Mexico. He has nothing to do with Dia de los Muertos. But for the context of the show and the flow of the show and the kind of musical needs of what went on at that month, that was a choice I made. And so I combined kind of those abstract elements of my compositional style with this human connection experience I had with some of my students. And that was how the show got written.
I think every teacher out there resonates with what the story you told us about.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And that compassionate, that teaching and learning, it's not a one-way arrow, that they give so much to us. And, let's just not hide it. There's 3 white guys who are here talking about a show that is not our background. And it does my heart so much good to hear the homework that you did and the work that you did to better understand, and that it was driven out of compassion from one of your students. To me, that's the definition of culturally responsive, is that you had a student who gave this gift to you, and that was your call to produce this work of art.
Scott, can I jump in real quick?
100%, yeah.
So to go off of that, one thing that I've also thought through this whole process that I feel like it's good to verbalize for other teachers here is when programming the show, I still feel somewhat uncomfortable with the show because there's things that I don't know. Not uncomfortable because I chose the show, but as band directors, we've all gone through, I think, a selection of music process of I'm going to choose music that I feel confident about, I know I'm knowledgeable about, I'm passionate about, and therefore I'm going to teach well, which is completely true. But there is a part of me as a band director that still feels very uncertain about myself. And like Randall, I'm also trying to learn Spanish right now. For a long time, I kind of just hit it and joked around with the kids, and it was funny that Mr. West doesn't know what the kids are saying, or I would purposely say something wrong in Spanish to get a laugh, to get around my uncomfortableness with it. And through programming the show, I've started to learn more, mostly because we're in the pandemic and I have a little extra time on my hands, and so I can actually do this now. But I think the show is going to go much further, that I've owned up to, hey, there's things about here that I don't know, and I need you guys to fill in the gaps here. I need you to teach me your expertise of this background, because I can't do it alone. And that just reinforces, I think, everything that we are trying to do in the classroom. That's not just coming from the director, but it is the voice of the students. And I'm not the one out there marching and playing. You guys are the ones that are performing. That's telling the story.
And from an SEL perspective, we're delving into identity. That's exactly where we're starting here. We're understanding our identity, our students' identity. So, Mike, how are you going to take this show and work it for your community?
So before the pandemic hit, we were already starting some steps of that, and there's so many things we talked about. I will try my best right now to not be long-winded, but there was a lot of great ideas from students. And I do want to start, too, from including a student voice that if anyone is thinking about this path, not necessarily, obviously, with Diadis and Muerto Show, but like embracing more of the students having control over the design process. And I'm sure we've all sat in different seminars or workshops that have talked about this. But I would say, too, like there's going to be conversations with your staff that may need a little convincing, a little bit, maybe uncomfortable. For example, I have a color art coach that I love. She is amazing. There's no way I would be able to do anything without her. But when I first brought up saying like, hey, I kind of want the kids to choose what the color guard uniforms are. We had a longer conversation than that, but that made her nervous because she has so much ownership of the program and she's so proud of it. And I said, though, like, that doesn't mean like they're going to pick a uniform and that's what we're going with. But we need to listen to what they know that is authentic with this event. And then we can come back from the design standpoint. Okay, like, this is a good idea. What if we modify it this here so it works on the field? Or could we change this color there? And through that conversation, the ball started to get rolling. Like, she felt more comfortable with it while we still empower the students. So, like, I think that was one of the first conversations we had when we chose the show, because I needed to make sure that the staff was on board before we started down this path. And then the next step was the student leadership. I feel like I'm very active with the student leadership. I meet with them on a regular basis in the spring just to train them. Every other week we have conversations, and more so it's just like you said, Scott, with SEL, it's figuring out who they are. Beyond the show, one of the activity that I will do every year is just talk about Myers-Briggs types. It's not the end-all be-all of the person we are, but it's just an activity we go through of like them self-reflecting of how do they process stuff, how do they respond to stuff, because if they know that, then they can better respond to their peers. So through these conversations that I have with student leaders, I talked more about what does this mean to us as students, us as a band program, us as a music program, us as a school, and us as a community. And some of the steps we took was how do we make a really powerful product that we are going to say at the end of the season, like, this is us, this is who we are. Because we had already established, like, we are really excited about this idea. So it would really suck if we got to the end of the season and it didn't live up to everything that we wanted it to be. Not saying that we wouldn't have bumps in the road. So we just had lengthy conversations about that. Like, I remember, like, having 2-hour conversations with, like, a dozen of my leaders, specifically, like, just letting them direct the conversation. And me just sitting there as a facilitator and posing questions about either stuff I didn't know, or if we had someone else who didn't understand the direction we were going with the student leaders, like, helping them understand. Because if we weren't all on board or didn't have a unified vision, it's going to be much harder to get the rest of the band to tell the story that we're telling on the field. So we did that, and then we also talked about how are we going to involve other people. And part of that process, too, was as student leaders, I gave them a couple questions that I wanted them to go home and talk to their parents. And so, like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, a big part of this was engaging other families that maybe haven't been part of the band culture or understood everything that we do in a music program. So one of my questions was, go home, ask your parents, if your family does celebrate Dia de los Muertos, what does it mean to them that we are trying to celebrate this event and show this to our community? Or if your family does not celebrate this event, what do they know about it? What does this mean to them? Or also, what would be an event they would want to see as a show on the field in future years? And so really just trying to continue those conversations at home Not saying that this single conversation is going to immediately mean that I now have 100 new parent volunteers, but maybe a couple more parents show up and ask me questions after rehearsal. Or at least we came back and talked about it, and we got feedback even before we started writing drill, finalizing uniforms, all the design aspects, and they had more input, and I heard what the families wanted to hear and wanted to see. And so rather than us designing a show, getting to like the premiere in August after band camp is done, and then a family member coming up to me like, that's not what I was expecting. That would have been much harder to make changes at that point, and because I want the community to feel like that this is a Round Lake show. This is not a marching band show.
Mike, what I love is how many questions you asked, and it wasn't seen as a design team. It was seen as a collaboration. There were a couple things that just really inspired me when you were thinking about this show. Can you tell us a little bit about the Ofrenda?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going. So we were still figuring out the exact story we wanted to tell in the Dia de Muertos, because like we love Randall's music and like we played it for the kids, and there was a lot of elements that like we could see their eyes light up, and immediately too. So like I mentioned before, I have a little bit of background in media, so I always make a trailer for the Marching Band show, and I promise I'm getting to the Ofrenda. We showed the trailer, and like kids showed up and like they cheered so much that we were doing this show. And my plan was to have a 5-minute marching band meeting, watch it, cool, rah, let's get excited, let's go recruit some more incoming freshmen, and I'll see ya. That turned into a 45-minute meeting where kids just kept throwing out ideas for the show, like, hey, can we do this? Can the drum majors wear this as a costume instead of the uniform? What if we did this kind of flag silk? It was at that point like I knew, okay, we got something special. Like we saw the investment. And so through those conversations, we talked about involving an Ofrenda in some way. For those of you that are listening that don't know what an Ofrenda is, and forgive me if I use any terms that is not completely accurate, it's basically an altar that's made up of pictures of loved ones that have passed as a way to respect them and celebrate them. So again, we're coming back to that idea of celebration and family. And we explored different ways of how can we make our own Round Lake Ofrenda. And we were kind of down to 2 different ways to represent this. And one was, do we make an Ofrenda as we go through every show that we perform? So like, is there a skeleton, a frame of an Ofrenda? And each band member then puts up an actual picture of someone from their family that has passed and they want to celebrate. And so really, like, every time we perform, it is us as a family, us as a community coming together to honor them. Another thought, too, was we have a very big Somos club. Like, that's basically our Hispanic club for anyone that doesn't have that at their own school that's listening. Pairing with them, and could we theme homecoming also that parallels our show, and at the homecoming game create a whole community of friendos, so like on the fence of the football field, and advertise, all right, anyone in the Round Lake community, please come, bring flowers, bring pictures, other things that would be included in Ofrenda, and at the end of the night, we'll just have this, what I would hope would be this massive celebration to all of our family members. And so regardless, either way, we really wanted something that wasn't just, we are doing a De Los Muertos show because this is what the kids want to do, but like, how are we extending the production of the show to connect beyond the field, to connect with the families, to connect with the community?
Beautiful, Mike. So, Randall, hearing that this is where the director is going to take this show, what are your thoughts?
Well, I definitely applaud all of this. And just to kind of give my background, like, I think sometimes, especially in the kind of competitive marching band world we're in right now, it's generally expected that people like myself who write for the marching arts are so, focused on competition that we don't see the bigger picture. And I think that's very inaccurate. I mean, I can't speak for all designers, but I know great designers who, that is not the case for. And I can speak for myself that my main goal with any show that I write is that student connection, and especially that audience connection. Because coming from the background that I came from at Harrisburg, I mean, we could have went out and won every single contest, and the community would have been proud. But what's going to really get them excited is what does our show mean to them? And so we would always try to find ways to connect our show to what they were doing. Just to play off what Mike said, I think the Frienda thing is a great idea. It reminds me of a show that I designed just the year before the pandemic, so the 2019 season, for a group here in Arkansas, and their entire show was. It just so happened that a large part of this community had been touched by cancer. And so they decided to do a show that honored cancer survivors and kind of did that whole thing. And it reminds me of the direction that Mike's taking this show, because I would say that was probably my other big experience with a show that touched on such an emotional level. Because similar to what Mike's talking about, we of course we did pink ribbons. The band actually participated in some race for the cure events and things like that, started getting community awareness for the show as opposed to just performing it. And then at the end of the show, the very last moment was, the band were all in pink garb, and we made the formation of a big ribbon on the field. And they all reached into their uniform and pulled out a picture of somebody in their life that had been touched by cancer. And so this reminds me strongly of that. And so I'm very, very proud. I'm very proud this is the direction it's being taken. Because don't get me wrong. I mean, ultimately, on a personal, selfish level, I'm like, well, do people like the music? But beside that, the human part of me and the educator part of me really responds to this, broader interpretation and this broader world vision. Because I think, especially in the wake of the political divisions, the social divisions that we've seen in the last 4 years, anything that is of a healing nature, anything that is for bringing students together, sharing culture, connecting with that common humanity, I think that should be applauded and celebrated. And quite frankly, Mike needs a raise.
I couldn't agree more. I'll call your principal, Mike.
I'll second that motion.
We'll put in a good word for you. 100%. So well stated, Randall. And I think we all need to hear that shouted from the rooftops. When we just simply think about the work, just kind of bringing it back to the SEL stage of talking about identity, belonging, and agency, I'm hearing it in the art here, and I'm hearing it in the manifestation on the field. This is just such a powerful example for us to take and understand that if we're doing marching band, concert band, whatever, that there are places that we can make this personal for our students if we only ask questions. So with that, I'm going to take a step back, and Mike and Randall, do you have any questions for each other?
I actually have a question for both of you, since we've been talking very big scope right now, and Randall, obviously, since you've also taught, I think some people listening right now might hear the breast cancer awareness idea or the Dia de los Muertos idea, and that's awesome, that's such a big idea. I have no idea how I get to that point. What are maybe some small steps that people can start taking in that direction rather than maybe biting off more they can chew right off the bat with something like this?
Well, for me, I think the first thing is to really, I think kind of what you did and what I did with both of our communities is first you have to get a sense of the community. Every community is different. Different things are going to be important to different people. I'll give you I just mentioned that one that I designed last year, but I'll take it one step back to something I did with my band. So the Harrisburg band, when I took it over, was very destitute. It was, just the stereotypical band that needs a total reboot. And so, we did that for many years, and it got better and better. But we wanted to be competitive, but also entertaining. One of the first shows that really struck a chord with our audience, we did this show called iBand. And it's one of these things we've talked about, celebrating a culture or celebrating, this cancer survivors. But I don't think you have to think that big to engage your community. Because I mean, you can, and it's great. But I think if you need to start smaller, just something like when you're doing a competitive show, just ask yourself this simple question: can my audience relate to this? Is this something they can relate to? Because we wanted to do this high concept techie show, but I was like, okay, so how is the average audience going to relate to this? Well, at that point, pretty much everybody in my audience had an iPhone, and they had all this technology that was becoming so commonplace in our households, and so we played off that. In like every movement of the show was an app, and like we had a computer narrator, and it was interesting because it made the audience feel smart. And another way we engaged them was with our T-shirt design that year. We just like the way we engaged the community was to create a T-shirt that showed our town literally as an iPhone, and the apps were all the elements of the community. So it was like the band, the football team, the cheerleaders, the community volleyball, all these things like listed as basically what makes it up. That's just a small example, and it's certainly not maybe as life changing as some other things that we've talked about. But I can tell you this much: we ended up, that was the only time in my entire years at Harrisburg we had to order extra band shirts because the demand was so great. And it really got the community involved, and we would start talking about just like technology, things like that. So I don't think you have to solely focus on these large scale world issues. I mean, we can, and that's great, but it's certainly not the only way to engage or connect with an audience. But I would say know your community, know who you're playing to, and capitalize on it.
And Mike, an answer I'm going to take Randall's answer was perfect, so I'm not even going to try to go in that direction. My thought is that the first step, oftentimes this type of engagement, the stories from Mike here and the stories from Randall here, these are the special teachers who are truly crafting a unique music education environment for their students. And sometimes yes, sometimes no, but that's not the environment that we've come from, that we've seen. That for us to truly capitalize on reaching our students, it takes courage. And oftentimes when it takes courage, it means that we're taking a step back. It means that we're not taking the entire design control of those guard uniforms. We're not taking the entire design control of the show. And that's out of so many of our comfort zones, because it's like, well, I'm the director. I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to give it to the students, and then we're going to put it on. And the examples that we're hearing today say, well, maybe if I ask a few more questions, that's how, Randall, I'm going to get to know my community. That's how I'm going to translate this show for something that is relevant to both the students who are going to be performing and the audience who's going to be watching. Other questions?
Sure, I'll ask one. So Mike, I think the big question is, because I'm just going to flat tell you, you're set up for success. I mean, like with what you're doing, the kids are going to love the show. They're going to be. It sounds like this is going to be a real success. And I mean, you picked great music. But the other thing with that is, I'm curious: is there any way you plan to, like for this year in particular, into concert season, into other things that you're going to do? Is this going to become a theme for the year? Like, are you maybe going to explore some concert works that will continue these conversations?
Absolutely. Like, it is something I've thought about, and I'll just kind of talk more broad because so just so everyone knows that's listening, we are still completely remote at Round Lake right now, and we don't know what the fall is going to look like, which I'm sure everyone is guessing. So don't know if it's going to be hybrid. Don't know if we're going to be back to full rehearsal. So I often think about what literature I want to play, because we haven't been able to play a whole lot this year, and like, how do I make that meaningful for students? And I would say too, with the other music teachers at Round Lake right now, that's probably our most common topic, is what are we doing right now to make it meaningful for our students? Because if it's meaningful, they'll be engaged. But in terms of having their voice in the music, yes, absolutely. For example, one thing we've already talked about is for our conference honor band. We have one every February. we've talked about how do we represent all the voices of the students in the conference when we don't know who's going to make honor band yet. One idea that I tossed out there, we would really love to commission a piece for our honor band, but is there a way that we could like choose 1 to 2 students from each of the schools to be the voice for that piece and talk to the composer and give direction to that story, and then those students will just automatically be accepted to honor band, so they get to play on the piece they helped create. I think what the response I've already received from students does indicate a path to success, and so I don't know what our future shows would be. Every director kind of talks like, oh, it'd be cool to do this, it'd be cool to do this theme, I want to tell this story. And I have shows in my back pocket that I would like to tell, but those are stories I want to tell. And I want to hear more of the stories of the students.
Folks, we're coming down to the end of our time for this episode, but both Mike and Randall, any last parting thoughts?
I would say, like one thing we just didn't touch on that I do want to kind of just reinforce, well, Scott, you touched on it a little bit, was having the courage to kind of release control, but also what we've talked about many times before is having the courage just to be vulnerable and showing what you don't know. And like I know, that word can also be kind of scary, just to be vulnerable. And I know before we started working together, Scott, when I was in front of my students, there were times I was vulnerable, but definitely by the end of the year of working together, I was much more vulnerable, and we saw students engaging with that more. So for anyone that's listening that is looking to go down this path of student empowerment, student engagement, part of it too is giving your own story and saying, I don't know this stuff, or like, this is what this story means to me, to help demonstrate to the students what you hopefully want to hear from them. It's validating their feelings, validating their stories, and sometimes, just like how we would model a rhythm for them, sometimes we need to model the type of discussion and the type of openness we want to see that you need for creative music making.
Randall, any parting thoughts for us?
Not so much on like what we've talked about, but just, I mean, it is vaguely about what we're talking about, but kind of wrapping it up. But just, it's just a reminder, if this whole conversation that we're having about, the student voice, I think this is going to be so important moving forward in the next few years. When we're coming out of this pandemic, we're going to be dealing with a lot of students and a lot of parents and, ourselves and, coworkers who are quite frankly going to be damaged by this event. And I think that's a lot of us are just now coming to realize like the full impact of the pandemic, of all of the stressors of 2020. I don't see how anybody could have lived through 2020, the pandemic, everything that has happened, and not be changed by it. So I think we need to be mindful of that as we move forward. That I know for myself, like I've always considered myself to be a compassionate and kind person, but moving forward out of this year, I want to be even more so, because I really do believe that any big act is nothing but a bunch of small acts put together. It's kind of like the same way when people ask me, how do you write a piece of music? I give what they probably think is a joke answer, but I tell them one note at a time. And that's really the way any great work is done. So if we're going to fix the world, if we're going to encourage our students to, be the next great generation, and if we're going to just make our own little corner of the world, even if it's just our classroom, better, it starts with us, and it starts with the actions we take every day. So I just want everybody to be mindful of that as we move forward.
Randall, we couldn't be sent off with better words. And the folks who have been watching, you've heard me say that part of our job in our music classroom is to lead our students from trauma back to trust through music in a way that we've always done it, through music education. And the stories that you've heard today, the connections that you've heard today, from composer to director to community, this is how we do it, folks. This is how we get our students back to trust from the trauma that we're experiencing right now. From the bottom of my heart, Randall Standridge, Mike West, thank you so much. Powerful episode. Be well, be safe, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you for having us.
Music for All's mission is to create, provide, and expand positively life-changing experiences through Music for All. Our vision is to be a catalyst to ensure that every child across America has access and opportunity to participate in active music making in their scholastic environment. I want to thank Randall Standridge and Mike West for their heartfelt contribution to this series. We talk about connecting dots. We connected the dots between composer, educator, and community. This was the epitome of identity, belonging, and agency. I'd like to thank our national presenting sponsor, the Yamaha Corporation of America. Be sure to check out the Yamaha Educator Suite at yamahaeducatorsuite.com, and I would like to express my continued thanks to GIA Publications for their support. Before we say goodnight, it is important that you understand that now more than ever, these uncertain times continue to impact Music for All, and we are extremely grateful for any donations gifted to our nonprofit organization. If you enjoyed tonight's program, and in order for us to continue to provide our free educational resources and advocacy materials, please consider gifting to Music for All at any amount. Your gift allows us to serve our mission with future educational programming such as this episode. Please visit musicforall.org/give. For Music for All, I'm Scott Edgar. Thank you.